Episode 25. They Call the Wind Korea. We move now fully into 1951. Before that, I want to ask again for your generosity. The fundraiser for Urban Gateways is still open and still working towards its goal. This week, I'd like to thank Avery and Mallory for their generous donations. Every dollar you donate goes directly to helping Chicago area youth connect with the arts, including documentary films. You thought I'd say podcasts, which is also a thing participants can get involved in, but it's not just podcasts. It's all different kinds of art across many different media, giving, I don't want to say just kids or teens because I think that minimizes what they're capable of, but it gives them the opportunity to explore different ways to tell the stories they want to tell, which is more important now than ever before. Even a $5 donation helps. I and all my colleagues on the Associate Board thank you for your support in advance. If you'd like to donate, please follow the link in the episode description, or just go to donate.urbangateways.org/Trevor Owens. Now, on to our episode. When we ended last week, the war had stabilized with two separate front lines, more or less. I say that because there wasn't much contact between United Nations and Communist forces. A quick note from here on out, now that the Chinese are in the war, I'll just use Communist as a shorthand for both the North Koreans and the Chinese, just as I have used UN forces as shorthand for all non-Communist forces. As you may remember, Peng Dehuai, commander of the People's Volunteer Army, had withdrawn much of the PVA back north towards the 38th parallel to recuperate and resupply after the UN forces withdrew themselves pretty deep into South Korea. There were some smaller instances of contact between UN and Communist forces. The PVA left some units behind in the gap, but for the most part, the bulk of the PVA was away from the UN front line. The Korea People's Army was in much the same boat, short of supplies and increasingly short of troops. The UN had continued their withdrawal further than necessary because, well, think about it. They had just been walloped by the Chinese and North Korea and were exhausted from the previous 6 months of fighting. They didn't know what was getting thrown at them, so the best they could do was to find a line that they felt really good about holding and plant themselves on that line to hold against whatever the Communists did next. They had no way of knowing that what the Communists would do next would be to disengage. On January 25th, 120 commanders of the PVA and KPA met outside Kangye at PVA headquarters to inaugurate the first PVA-KPA Joint Command meeting. This was part of an effort by Peng and Kim Il-sung to improve coordination between their armies and sprang from an agreement between the two that firmly placed the Chinese at the top of the command pyramid in Korea. Peng opened the meeting by admitting that UN forces were largely superior, but they could be defeated through, quote, the commander's flexibility and the infantryman's bravery, end quote. Continuing with the specific successful tactics used so far, Peng praised those that commanded night attacks, or established skilled groups of soldiers adept at fighting behind enemy lines, or the mobility of the units in performing an active defense when necessary. Although the discussion continued on a positive trajectory, with Peng, Mao, and Kim all urging cooperation and collaboration, things quickly dissolved into insults and criticism once the commanders broke out into smaller groups. The KPA commanders' issue with the PVA was that they were too cautious. They had the UN forces on the ropes and should not have stopped their offensive earlier in January. And I don't know exactly what was said by the PVA commanders in response to that criticism, but I think an understandable and logical conjecture of a response would be for the PVA commanders to tell the KPA commanders to sit down, hush up, and let the people who are bailing them out run the show. The KPA was about to lose the war before the Chinese intervention, so I think the PVA commanders would feel pretty high and mighty over their Korean comrades after the successes of their intervention so far. I'm not saying that's what was said. I am only saying that the PVA commanders would not be wrong to say things like that, and I would not be surprised if that was what they said. What we do know from Wada Haruki is that Kim attended this meeting and was extremely confident in their ability to win the war. We haven't talked about Kim in a while, but know that he has used the war to further entrench himself and his former guerrilla comrades deeper into the growing state apparatus of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. He's still fighting those factional politics that we talked about like 13 or 14 episodes ago, but he's starting to realize that maybe he should think about cleaning house once he's won the war. The joint meeting ended on January 29th, when Peng dismissed the commanders back to their units. Mao had written Peng, exhorting him to at least advance another 60 miles to the 36th parallel. Peng knew that could not happen given the depleted state of both the PVA and the KPA. The best he could hope for was that the fourth phase offensive would satisfy Mao at the lowest possible cost of men and material. Before their dismissal back to the front, though, the communist leadership in Korea received their first reports of a new United Nations offensive in the south. That offensive, known as Operation Thunderbolt, was born out of Matthew Ridgway's desire to figure out what exactly was going on with the Chinese and North Koreans in that gap area between the quote-unquote front lines. The core of Thunderbolt was built around this measured advance from Line D, that line of withdrawal we discussed last week, northward, with 5 phase lines every 5 miles to give each advancing division time to pause, assess, report, and then receive the next order. This was reconnaissance in force at its finest, with large units moving forward in a cohesive manner to better ascertain the enemy's strength and position. On the morning of January 25th, each of the columns set off, advancing north on their road. They also screened the flanks in between columns to ensure no enemy force was bypassed and given the chance to strike from the rear. Advancing UN forces met sporadic resistance moving north, recapturing Suwon during the early afternoon of the 26th. Don't think that this advance was another quick march up the peninsula like what happened back in September 1950. This was a measured, plodding sweep northward, almost literally sweeping up any communist units that might have been passed over if the tactics used earlier in the war were used now. Ridgway had learned from his predecessor's mistakes, and it was imperative those mistakes were not made again. That's why the advance was brutally slow in the last 2 days of January, as the UN forces moving north encountered larger groups of Chinese and North Korean troops. As January turned over to February, with Ridgway ordering his corps commanders in the 8th Army to engage all UN units in Thunderbolt, the operation switched from a large-scale reconnaissance mission to a full attack, with UN forces engaging communist forces across the entire 8th Army front in the west. That full attack began in earnest on February 1st, with Ridgway's stated goal for his troops to reach the southern bank of the Han River. Ridgway understood the symbolic value of recapturing Seoul, but did not want to do so too hastily because, strategically, it was the wrong move. Recapturing the city was not beneficial enough to make the operation worthwhile, and to do so would actually leave UN forces in that sector worse off, as they would be in a position that was more difficult to defend and more difficult to withdraw from than their objective of the southern bank of the Han River. Ridgway further outlined his mindset in a February 3rd letter to Douglas MacArthur. Ridgway stated his primary goal for operational planning was to maximize the enemy's losses while minimizing UN losses. That seems like a pretty obvious goal, but it stands in contrast to the previous UN mindset of capturing territory, not necessarily inflicting losses. These aren't mutually exclusive, but they are certainly not the same thing. Ridgway was perfectly content to stop at a good defensive line and pound the enemy into submission, even if it left places occupied that some other commanders might more quickly try to capture. That goal was quickly exemplified at the Battle of the Twin Tunnels on February 1st near Wonju in the center of the front. An American patrol was ambushed by Chinese forces near a set of tunnels, were reinforced overnight, then fought a fierce battle the next day, and won the American way, with copious amounts of artillery support and a great many airstrikes. Just as the Chinese were playing to their strengths by keeping to the countryside, the Americans were realizing once again how to best use their own strengths. The Battle of the Twin Tunnels was a precursor to Ned Almond's operation in support of Thunderbolt. Named Roundup, this operation would jumpstart the advance on the 8th Army's right flank, up the center of the country, securing vital supply routes up from Busan. Roundup would take units from X Corps and the ROKA's 3rd Corps north from Wonju to Hongcheon, 25 miles overland. These two UN corps would face off against the 2 North Korean Army Corps holding the center, starting the attack on February 5th in conjunction with the continuing Thunderbolt. This operation was to go ahead much the same as Thunderbolt, moving north in a measured fashion so as to keep as many opportunities for attack away from the Communists as possible. Back west, I Corps captured Kimpo Airfield in Incheon on February 10th. the greatest resistance they encountered coming from poorly hidden landmines and sporadic machine gun fire. Between I Corps and X Corps, Ninth Corps was marching to the Han over tougher terrain than I Corps, meaning that their advance was slower than their colleagues despite meeting similar numbers of the enemy on the way. That resistance increased on the 9th as Ninth Corps began to encounter Chinese units guarding a bridgehead area in the curve of the Han River. This area was surrounded by the Han on one side and a string of defensible ridges along the southern and western borders. Ridgway had an intelligence report in hand from the 8th Army headquarters staff that accurately identified the chief weakness of the Communist forces as their logistics and supply issues. That report also stated that these issues could be solved at any time, given that the pause in the conflict had lasted for a few weeks already, and a Communist attack was most likely imminent. The Chinese response to Thunderbolt and Roundup began on February 11th. The fourth phase offensive was the offensive Mao had wanted since the third phase offensive ground to a halt. In the week leading up to this, after Mao's initial order for a new offensive, Peng had cabled him multiple times trying to tamper his enthusiasm. Peng did not believe this offensive would be their final one. Communist forces were not yet strong enough to strike the final blow. After a period of rest and resupply, the PVA were once again capable of sustaining combat for a meaningful period of time, but even then that was still just a few days at best. With the decision forced upon them to conduct an offensive, the question for the PVA and KPA then became one of its target. In the center, Chipyong-ni and Heungsong were both considered good targets and would alleviate pressure off PVA armies in neighboring sectors. These places were not that far apart, mind you. It was decided early on that the center was the weakest part of the UN front line, and planning moved on from there. Two of the army commanders involved in the planning process, Han Jianchu and Deng Hua, each argued for each target, respectively. Chipyong-ni was closer to the PVA's position and would directly assist the 38th Army, while Heungsong was less defended and held a more central position on the line, about 10 miles northeast of Wonju. Deng won, and on the 11th, 3 PVA divisions, the 117th, 120th, and 198th Divisions, alongside the KPA's 5th Corps, surrounded the ROKA 8th Division, north of Heungsong. The Communist divisions broke through the regimental defensive lines, scattering units from each other and cutting them off from division headquarters in Heungsong. The 8th Division was quickly broken as an effective fighting unit. 2/3 of its fighting strength was destroyed, which is a cleaner way of saying that 2/3 of the men in the division were killed over the next few days of fighting. Elsewhere around the center section of the front line, where the Chinese concentrated their offensive, American and South Korean units faced great difficulty in organized retreats. Equipment was abandoned in the hasty withdrawals, and vehicles were destroyed by gunfire from the hills overlooking the narrow paths they tread. Almond ordered a withdrawal on the 12th, ending the Battle of Heungsong by the following day as all UN units withdrew to Wonju, clear Communist victory. In total, 11,862 UN soldiers were killed during the battle, with 9,844 of those South Korean. It is safe to say that the Communists were now riding high after this victory. Almond's withdrawal brought X-Corps and the attached ROKA divisions to a line just north of Wonju, stretching southeast from the village of Chipyong-ni. There are 3 battles during these next 5 days that are sometimes described as the Gettysburg of the Korean War, as the high watermark of the Communist advance in 1951. These battles, the Third Battle of Wonju, the Battle of Chipyong-ni, and the Battle of Juamni, are usually described separately and certainly are distinct engagements, but are intimately connected to each other as operations against Chipyong-ni and Juamni were both undertaken by the Communists to exploit UN weaknesses around Wonju. However, these 3 battles were hastily organized by the PVA and thus went ahead with inaccurate intelligence about the strength of the UN forces in the area. Deng thought the enemy forces in the area to be about 2/3 of their actual strength, a serious miscalculation that, honestly, I can't really blame him for. He was optimistic after the quick success of Heungsong, and I think he was right to believe that, like in months past, a quick success should be followed up by further pressure when possible. Unfortunately for him, sustaining that pressure was not as possible as he thought. The Communist attacks began again on the night of the 13th, with Chinese units moving into the hills surrounding the valley of Chipyong-ni, where American, Dutch, and French forces were set up for the night. Multiple infantry and mortar attacks hit the UN line throughout the night, only ending with first light and the threat of American air power. The attack resumed the next night, with PVA artillery thrown into the mix. American transport planes attempted multiple supply drops throughout the night, but these were placed within Chinese sightlines. Some UN soldiers were killed attempting to retrieve those crates. The perimeter was broken at multiple points, but a full collapse was prevented and the UN men at Chipyong-ni held until armored reinforcements arrived on the afternoon of the 15th. There is a striking painting of this battle that was completed by a US Army artist after the fact that I'll post online that shows just a bit of the intensity of the fighting at Chipyong-ni. As those tanks were fighting their way towards Chipyong-ni on the 15th, the British Commonwealth Brigade was doing much the same near Chuam-ni, about 5 miles to the southeast. They were on their way to relieve 2 companies of the US 2nd and 9th Infantry Divisions who had attempted to plug a gap in the UN line the day before. Both groups were attacked and fought bravely before the Chinese withdrew on the 16th. The Battle of Chuam-ni is not a major engagement, but the PVA did exact a relatively high toll on the UN forces involved, with over 200 killed or wounded. That said, the Communists' early withdrawal from the battle cast this as a UN victory, albeit a Pyrrhic one. After the UN loss at Hengsong and their withdrawal south, the stage was set for the Third Battle of Wonju. As we discussed last week, Wonju sits in a natural bowl smack in the middle of the front line at this point of the war. The hills and mountains south of Wonju were the site of the first and second battles, which were a stalemate victory for the UN. The third battle, though, expanded out to the villages east of Wonju, like Pyeongchang and Checheon. The PVA's battle plan had the KPA's 5th and 2nd Corps attacking on the left flank to the east of the main attack on Wonju to tie up UN reinforcements and cut off UN supply lines. The main attack on Wonju was led by the PVA's 39th and 40th Armies against the US X Corps and the ROK 1st Corps. Again, barrage from aircraft and artillery stunted the Chinese advance, but the attacks continued across the sector for the next few days. Coordination with the neighboring ROK 3rd Corps on X Corps' right flank to the east of the battle kept KPA forces from forcing a break in the line. Even though hasty regimental retreats left valuable equipment behind and scattered some men to the countryside, the line continued to hold through the 17th. Although the fighting was difficult in some places, the constant maneuvering and remaneuvering that had given the KPA and PVA the upper hand early in the battle had exhausted their soldiers and brought about an early end to their offensive. The next night, Ridgway began planning his next step, Operation Killer. In those battles of mid-February, Peng saw the warning signs of a new war. The UN forces, specifically Ridgway chief amongst their commanders, had apparently learned from the mistakes of 1950. UN advances now were slower, but were more unified. Gaps in the line were more difficult to find, specifically because UN units kept in close contact with those on their flanks. The communist tactic of dividing and conquering could still work, but was quickly becoming much more difficult. On a trip to Beijing on February 20th, Mao instructed Peng to prepare to win a slow war, if he could not win a quick one. Before we end, I just want to say that during February of 1951, the Republic of Korea Army perpetrated 2 sizable massacres, the Gochang Massacre and the Sancheon Hamyang Massacre. Both were done in the southernmost district of South Korea, and together, an estimated 1,424 civilians were killed, most of whom were women, children, or elderly persons. All were suspected of communist sympathies, which was a death sentence in wartime Korea. Both massacres were conducted by the 11th Division of the ROKA, commanded by Cho Duk-sin, who, funnily enough, defected to North Korea 35 years later, in 1986. We will spend more time discussing life as a civilian during the Korean War in a couple weeks, because it's one of those things that both deserves a full discussion, but also doesn't really fit into a straightforward timeline of the war. I mean, civilians were there during everything. These battles were happening around them in their villages, in their homes. So it's something that really, expands the whole war. There's a couple topics that fit that mold, but I'll get into that more as we get closer to those episodes. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with the tide of the battle swinging back around to the United Nations. Next week, we will discuss the dismissal of Douglas MacArthur. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. If your podcast service doesn't have that, feel free to send me an email at ctcapodcast@gmail.com, just like the website ctcapodcast@gmail.com. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.